Enjoy your swim with the sharks. That was the last thing my husband whispered in my ear before his hand slammed into my back. The freezing ocean air whipped past my face as I plummeted from the top deck of our chartered yacht. Right before I hit the water, I heard the unmistakable sound of my father-in-law laughing while ice clinked in his martini glass. My name is Vanessa, 33 years old, and I am a self-made billionaire. Or at least I was supposed to be. If you have ever trusted the wrong person and paid the ultimate price, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you want to find out how I survived the freezing ocean to give my husband the exact payback he deserved. The impact with the water knocked the breath completely out of my lungs. Salt water rushed into my nose and throat, blinding me and choking me all at once. I kicked frantically, fighting the heavy-weighted fabric of my evening gown. When I finally broke the surface, gasping for air, the yacht was already pulling away. Its bright lights reflected on the black waves, getting smaller and smaller in the distance. I screamed Preston's name, but the roar of the massive luxury engines easily drowned out my voice. I treaded water, watching my husband of 4 years leave me to die in the middle of international waters. The freezing temperature of the ocean started shutting down my muscles almost immediately, but the betrayal burned hot enough to keep my heart beating. Just 48 hours ago, I had signed the final paperwork to sell my biotech startup for $5.5 billion. It was the culmination of a decade of relentless work in the lab, developing a breakthrough gene therapy. I had poured my entire youth into that company. Preston told me we needed to celebrate. He chartered this massive luxury vessel for a private getaway, just the two of us, and his father Charles. I thought Charles being there was a little odd, but Preston insisted his dad wanted to toast to my incredible success. I had no idea their toast was a death sentence. My limbs grew heavier with every passing second. The ocean was pitch black, and the violent swells kept crashing over my head, pulling me under. I had to shed the gown. Treading water, I struggled with the zipper along my spine, tearing the expensive silk fabric away until I was only in my undergarments. The cold was agonizing. It felt like a million tiny needles piercing my skin all at once. As I kicked my legs to stay afloat, the pieces of the puzzle started falling into place with sickening clarity. Preston always had that perfect charismatic smile, the kind of smile that made investors trust him instantly. When we met, I was just a tired scientist with a prototype, and he was the charming broker who promised to take me to the top. I thought we were a team. I thought he loved me. But lying in the freezing water, I saw the horrible truth. I was just a walking trust fund to him. A highly profitable project he had been managing for 4 years, waiting for the perfect time to cash out. He had been overly involved with my legal team during the acquisition. He kept pushing me to update my estate planning documents before the sale closed. I was so exhausted from the corporate negotiations that I signed whatever his lawyers put in front of me. Now I realized exactly what I had signed. If I died at sea, my body might never be found. He would play the grieving widower, file a presumptive death report, and inherit every single penny of my $5.5 billion fortune. And Charles, his ruthless real estate tycoon father, who was currently facing massive IRS fraud investigations, would get the cash injection he desperately needed to save his crumbling empire. Charles never liked me anyway. He made that obvious from the day we met. To him, I was just a lab rat who got lucky, not real upper-class money. They needed to remove the one obstacle standing between them and a lifetime of absolute power. Me. A massive wave crashed over me, pushing me deep underwater. I swallowed salt water and panicked, thrashing wildly in the dark. When I fought my way back to the surface, my hand hit something hard. It was a large plastic storage cooler, probably blown off the deck of another boat during a storm days ago. It was half submerged, but it floated. I grabbed the thick plastic handles with my freezing fingers and pulled my upper body out of the water, resting my chest on the hard surface. I shivered uncontrollably, my teeth chattering so hard my jaw ached. Lying there adrift in the absolute darkness, I thought about my parents. They had sacrificed everything to put me through college. If I died here, Preston would not give them a single dime. He would probably kick them out of the house I bought for them, just out of spite. I thought about the years I spent building my company, missing holidays and birthdays, sleeping on the cold floor of my office. All of it so two greedy men could toss me overboard like garbage and steal my legacy. The fear inside me slowly hardened into a cold, calculated rage. I was not going to die in this ocean. I was going to live, and I was going to take absolutely everything from them. Hours passed like lifetimes. The cold seeped deep into my bones, bringing me to the dangerous edge of hypothermia. I had to keep talking to myself out loud just to stay awake. I plotted every single move I would make if I survived this night. I visualized Preston's face when he realized his perfect murder had failed. I imagined Charles losing his precious real estate empire brick by brick. The burning desire for revenge was the only thing keeping my core temperature up. Every time my eyes fluttered shut, a freezing wave would splash my face, jarring me awake. I stared up at the indifferent stars and focused on the anger. Just as the sky began to turn a faint, bruised purple in the east, I heard a rhythmic thumping sound, a motor. I lifted my heavy head from the cooler, my neck stiff and screaming in pain. Through the thick morning mist, a small Mexican fishing boat was cutting through the swells. I tried to shout, but my throat was completely raw. My voice was nothing but a raspy, silent whisper. I managed to raise one freezing arm, waving it frantically in the air. The boat kept moving. I splashed the water with my last ounce of strength, praying they would see the disruption in the waves. Then the engine cut off. A bright spotlight hit my face, blinding me. Rough, calloused hands reached down over the side, grabbing my arms and hauling me over the edge of the wooden boat. I collapsed onto the hard deck, coughing up seawater and gasping for sweet air. The fishermen wrapped me in coarse woolen blankets, shouting to each other in a panic. I could not understand their words, but I knew I was safe. I closed my eyes as the warmth of the blankets surrounded me. Preston thought he was feeding me to the sharks, but he had no idea he had just created a monster that was coming back to swallow him whole. The captain of the small vessel was a weathered man named Matteo. He wrapped another coarse blanket around my trembling shoulders and handed me a battered tin cup of hot coffee. My hands shook violently as I took it, spilling dark liquid over my numb fingers. I did not care about the burning sensation. I needed the heat to remind me I was still alive. The cramped cabin smelled of diesel fuel and old fish, but to me it was a sanctuary. Matteo spoke broken English, but his eyes held deep sympathy. He pointed to the radio equipment on the dashboard, asking if I wanted him to call the Coast Guard. I shook my head immediately. Calling the authorities meant alerting Preston that I had survived. I needed information first. I needed to know what my husband was doing while he thought my body was sinking to the bottom of the ocean. I asked Matteo for his satellite phone. He hesitated, looking at my dripping hair and shivering frame, but he eventually pulled a heavy black device from a waterproof case and handed it to me. My fingers were so stiff I could barely punch in the international dialing code. I called the direct emergency line for my private wealth manager in New York. The line crackled with heavy static before ringing. When he answered, his voice was tense and clipped. I told him it was Vanessa. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. He gasped, asking if this was some kind of sick joke. I demanded he tell me what was going on with my accounts right now. His next words hit me harder than the freezing ocean waves. He told me that less than 3 hours ago, Preston had contacted the bank with a team of lawyers. Preston had presented an emergency medical and financial power of attorney. It was a document I never signed. The bank had no choice but to comply with the legal paperwork, especially since Preston had already filed a preliminary report with the maritime authorities declaring me lost at sea and presumed dead. My black card was frozen. My personal checking accounts were locked. My access to the corporate funds from the $5.5 billion buyout was completely suspended, pending an official death certificate. I hung up the phone, my chest heaving as the reality of Preston's terrifying efficiency set in. He did not just push me off a boat. He had orchestrated a flawless, hostile takeover of my entire existence. He had the fake documents ready. He had the corrupt lawyers on standby waiting for his call in the middle of the night. He had probably rehearsed his grieving husband performance while I was busy finalizing the sale of my biotech company. My blood boiled. I handed the phone back to Matteo and asked if his boat had internet access. He nodded, pointing to a mounted tablet used for weather tracking and GPS. I brought up a secure web browser and logged into my private cloud storage, using my encrypted two-factor backup codes. My heart pounded against my ribs as I scanned my recent email traffic. Preston had already forwarded instructions to my executive team. He was calling for an emergency board meeting to formally step in as acting chief executive officer of my holding company. He was moving to fast-track the transfer of the billions into a new offshore trust account, an account he solely controlled. I clicked on the legal attachments he had sent to my compliance department. There it was, the forged power of attorney. The signature was a flawless replication of my own. He must have meticulously traced it from our marriage license. The sheer audacity of his plan was suffocating. He and his father, Charles, were not wasting a single second. Charles desperately needed $1 billion in cash to pay off the IRS and keep himself out of federal prison for massive tax fraud. Preston was going to hand him my life's work on a silver platter. I closed the tablet and stared out the salt-stained window of the cabin. The sun was fully up now, casting a harsh, glaring light over the rolling ocean waves. I could not just fly back to New York and walk into a police station. Preston had the money, the lawyers, and the public narrative. If I showed up alive without a bulletproof plan, he would easily claim I had suffered a mental breakdown and jumped. Or worse, he would just hire a professional to finish the job on land. I needed to move like a ghost. I turned back to Matteo. I had stripped off my soaking wet gown while treading water, but I still wore my diamond stud earrings. They were custom pieces worth at least $50,000. I unscrewed the backings and placed the sparkling stones on the navigation chart, right in front of him. I told him I needed him to bypass all the major ports. I needed him to drop me off at a quiet coastal marina in Mexico, where nobody would ask for my passport or scan my identity. Matteo looked at the diamonds glistening in the morning light and then looked at the fierce determination in my eyes. He swept the earrings into his pocket without a word and adjusted the steering wheel, turning the fishing boat toward a remote stretch of the Baja coastline. The journey took another agonizing 5 hours. I spent the time drying my undergarments by the engine vent and formulating my strategy. I was officially stripped of my company, my bank accounts, and my legal identity. But Preston forgot one crucial detail. Before the acquisition, I had set up a hidden emergency cryptocurrency wallet, funded with $200,000, just in case my biotech startup ever faced a hostile corporate raid. I never told him about it. It was completely untraceable. When the fishing boat finally bumped against the wooden docks of a sleepy fishing village, I thanked Matteo and stepped off. My legs were trembling, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I walked into a dusty local electronics shop and used a small gold ring I still wore to barter for a cheap burner smartphone and some local currency. Connecting to the shop's unstable internet, I accessed my hidden wallet and wired funds to a private aviation broker I trusted implicitly. I booked a discreet charter flight out of a small private airstrip an hour away, flying directly to a secondary airport in New Jersey. As I sat in the back of a rattling taxi heading toward the airstrip, I looked at my reflection in the smudged window. My hair was matted with salt, my face was incredibly pale, and my lips were cracked and bleeding. I looked exactly like a woman who had returned from the dead, and that was exactly what I was. I was going to let Preston plan my funeral. I was going to let him think he had won the ultimate prize, and when he was at the absolute height of his triumph, I was going to rip his entire world apart piece by piece. But I could not do it alone. I needed an ally on the inside, someone who hated the family just as much as I did. I knew exactly who to call. The private jet touched down on a rain-slicked runway at a small municipal airport in New Jersey just after midnight. The flight from Mexico had given me plenty of time to think, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins made sleep absolutely impossible. I thanked the pilot who did not ask any questions after receiving the massive anonymous cryptocurrency transfer I had sent him from the fishing village. I pulled the hood of my oversized dark sweater over my head and stepped out into the freezing night air. A driver I had hired through a discreet encrypted app was waiting by the edge of the tarmac. I climbed into the back of the heavy black sedan and told him to drive toward Manhattan. As we sped down the empty highway, the glowing skyline of New York City appeared in the distance. It was my city. The place where I had built my massive biotech empire from the ground up over a decade of blood and sweat. Now I was sneaking back into it like a hunted fugitive. My first instinct, the moment I touched American soil, was to tell the driver to take me straight to the nearest police precinct or the FBI field office. I wanted to walk through those glass doors, demand federal protection, and watch an armed tactical team drag Preston out of our penthouse in handcuffs. But my finger hovered over the screen of my cheap burner phone, and a cold realization stopped me. I remembered a high-profile charity gala we had attended 6 months ago. Preston had been drinking heavily, and he cornered the local police commissioner near the open bar. He bragged openly about funding the re-election campaigns of half the district judges in the state and keeping local precinct captains on a generous retainer for corporate security favors. If I walked into a local police station looking like a hysterical soaking wet woman who had just survived a drowning, the desk sergeant would not call the detectives. He would call Preston. My loving husband would rush down to the station playing the relieved hero. He would insist I was suffering from severe trauma or a psychotic break and needed immediate private psychiatric care. I would be stuffed into the back of a private ambulance and driven to a remote facility. A tragic overdose or a fatal accident would follow shortly after. No, I could not trust the authorities. Not yet. I had to remain a ghost until I had undeniable proof and the financial power to destroy them completely. That was why I needed Kendra. I dialed her number on my burner phone, praying she was awake. Kendra was married to Wyatt. Wyatt was Preston's younger brother, a gentle classical pianist who wanted absolutely nothing to do with his family's ruthless business dealings. Kendra was the complete opposite of the docile, obedient wives Charles preferred to have in his family. She was a brilliant African-American tax attorney who had clawed her way to the top of a prestigious corporate law firm. From the day Wyatt introduced her to the family, Charles and Preston had treated her with thinly veiled contempt. They constantly directed racist microaggressions at her, criticizing her hair, her background, and her unapologetic ambition. They thought she was beneath them. But I always knew Kendra was the smartest person in any room she walked into. We had a quiet, mutual respect, and more importantly, we both knew exactly how evil the men in that family truly were. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up. Her voice was thick with sleep, but immediately sharp. She demanded to know who was calling her private number at 1 in the morning. I took a deep breath and spoke my name. The silence on the other end was absolute. I told her I knew she thought I was dead, but I was alive and I needed her help right now. To prove it was really me, I quickly recited a private conversation we had shared 3 weeks ago about a highly specific corporate tax loophole. I heard her sharp intake of breath. She did not ask unnecessary questions. She did not panic or scream. She immediately switched into the cold, calculating lawyer mode that made her so terrifying in the courtroom. She gave me the address of a secure underground parking garage near her law office and told me to meet her there in exactly 1 hour. When my hired car pulled into the dimly lit concrete structure, I saw Kendra's sleek black sedan, already parked in the darkest corner. I paid my driver in cash and waited until his taillights disappeared up the ramp before stepping out of the shadows. Kendra stepped out of her car, wearing a heavy beige trench coat over her silk pajamas. When she saw my bruised face and my salt-crusted hair, her eyes widened in profound shock, but she maintained her iron composure. She unlocked the passenger door and shoved me inside, blasting the heater. She handed me a bottle of water and a thick wool blanket from her back seat without saying a word. As I drank the water greedily, I told her everything. I told her about the yacht, the push, the freezing water, and the emergency power of attorney Preston had forged to lock me out of my own life. Kendra gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned pale. Then she looked at me and delivered the missing pieces of the puzzle. She told me she had been secretly digging into Charles and Preston's financial records for months because they were trying to force Wyatt to sign away his legal inheritance. What she found hidden in their offshore ledgers was staggering. Preston was not just managing bad investments. He had secretly borrowed $200 million from a ruthless money laundering cartel based in Miami to cover his catastrophic illegal gambling debts and his failed offshore shell companies. The cartel had given him a strict ultimatum: pay up by the end of the month, or they would take the debt out in blood. But that was not even the worst of it. Charles, the great real estate titan, was completely insolvent. The IRS had been secretly investigating his primary corporation for massive tax evasion. They were preparing to seize his entire portfolio of commercial properties unless he could produce $1 billion in liquid cash to settle the federal penalties and back taxes. They were both desperate, drowning men, and my $5.5 billion buyout was the only life raft big enough to save them both from prison and the cartel. Kendra looked at me with a fierce, burning intensity in her dark eyes. She told me Preston was moving incredibly fast. He was planning to wire my billions into a Cayman Islands account the second the bank processed my official death certificate. We sat in the warm car, surrounded by the cold concrete of the parking garage, and formed a silent pact. They had tried to bury me in the ocean, and they had tried to strip Kendra of her dignity for years. Now we were going to take everything they valued and burn their entire empire to the ground. Kendra threw the car into drive, and the tires squealed against the concrete as we sped out of the underground garage. The heating vents blasted hot air, but I was still shaking. Not from the cold anymore, but from the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. As we navigated the empty streets of Manhattan, heading toward her secure apartment, Kendra laid out the exact details of my husband's impending downfall. She did not speak with panic or fear. She spoke with the cold, clinical precision of a top-tier tax attorney who had finally found the smoking gun she had been hunting for. She explained that Charles had always thought she was just a diversity hire. Whenever she attended family dinners, Charles would make passive-aggressive comments about her natural hair or ask if she understood the big words he used when discussing his real estate portfolio. He severely underestimated her intelligence. 3 months ago, Charles had tried to bully Wyatt into signing a stack of legal documents under the guise of an early inheritance transfer. Wyatt, being an artist who hated confrontation, almost signed them. But Kendra intercepted the paperwork. She spent 3 sleepless nights analyzing the complex legal jargon and discovered it was not an inheritance. Charles was trying to legally restructure his failing holding company to make Wyatt the primary liable officer. The IRS was not just auditing Charles. They were preparing a massive criminal indictment for decades of tax evasion and fraudulent property valuations. Charles needed a fall guy, and he chose his own youngest son. When Kendra blocked the signature, Charles was furious. He called her a gold digger and banned her from the family estate. That was his fatal mistake. Kendra used her specialized legal access to quietly dig into the deepest, darkest corners of the family finances. What she found on Preston was even worse. My charismatic husband had been playing high-stakes offshore poker and funneling money into fake shell companies to cover his losses. He got in way over his head and borrowed $200 million from a notorious money laundering cartel operating out of Miami. The cartel did not care about his charming smile or his country club memberships. They gave him a hard deadline: pay the money back with massive interest, or they would start mailing pieces of him to his father. We pulled into the secure parking deck of Kendra's luxury apartment building. Wyatt was currently in Europe touring with an orchestra, which meant we had the place completely to ourselves. As soon as we walked through her front door, Kendra locked the deadbolts and led me straight into her home office. It looked like a command center. Multiple high-resolution monitors covered the desk, surrounded by stacks of heavily redacted financial files. She handed me a set of dry clothes and pointed to the adjoining bathroom, telling me to change quickly, while she booted up her encrypted network. When I emerged wearing an oversized college sweatshirt and sweatpants, I felt a tiny fraction of my humanity returning. I sat in the leather chair beside Kendra, staring at the glowing screens. She brought up a sophisticated tracking program she had custom built. It displayed a terrifying web of international bank routing numbers and offshore accounts. She pointed to a specific account registered in the Cayman Islands under a shell corporation named after my favorite flower. The sheer psychological cruelty of that detail made my stomach churn. Preston is bribing a state judge, Kendra said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Usually declaring someone dead in absentia takes years. But Preston has greased enough palms to push through an emergency presumptive death order, citing the Maritime Report and a fabricated suicide note he claims to have found in your office. He expects the judge to sign the order by tomorrow morning. The second that ink dries, the bank will unlock your corporate funds. He has an automated wire transfer queued up to instantly route the $5.5 billion into this Cayman account. From there, he will pay off the cartel, give his father the billion for the IRS, and disappear with the rest. I stared at the screen, watching the little digital timer Kendra had managed to track down on the bank's pending transaction log. We had less than 24 hours before my husband legally erased my existence and stole my life's work. I took a deep breath and cracked my knuckles. I told Kendra that Preston might have forged my signature and bribed a judge, but he fundamentally misunderstood how my biotech company's security infrastructure actually worked. I was not just a figurehead CEO, I was a paranoid scientist who had spent years protecting highly sensitive genetic research from corporate espionage. When I finalized the $5.5 billion buyout, I insisted on implementing a specialized security failsafe, a financial poison pill. I explained to Kendra that the holding account containing the billions was locked behind a proprietary biometric firewall. Preston could waive all the fake death certificates he wanted at the bank managers, but the digital vault required my direct authorization to release the funds. Preston thought he had disabled the biometric requirement when he forged the emergency power of attorney. He assumed standard banking protocols applied. He had no idea the protocol was hardwired into a decentralized server that I personally controlled. If we could access that server before the judge signed the death order, I could legally trap the money in a place where neither Preston nor his cartel buddies could ever touch it. Kendra's eyes lit up with a dangerous, predatory gleam. She quickly pulled up a secure virtual private network and masked our IP address through multiple international servers to ensure Preston's hired hackers could not trace us. She handed me a heavy, black, encrypted laptop. It was time to go to war. I rested my fingers on the keyboard, feeling a surge of adrenaline wash away the lingering cold of the ocean. My husband wanted to play a high-stakes game with my life. Now it was my turn to roll the dice. I opened the heavy black laptop and typed a string of commands that only 3 people in the world knew. The screen blinked, transitioning from a standard desktop interface into the stark black and green command terminal of my company's central server. Kendra sat beside me, her eyes darting between her own monitors, tracking the digital breadcrumbs Preston was leaving across the banking network. He was sloppy. He relied entirely on the brute force of his high-priced lawyers and his forged documents, assuming that the bank compliance department would fold under the pressure. He never bothered to understand the actual architecture of the network he was robbing. "I am in the mainframe," I told Kendra, my voice steady despite the rapid beating of my heart. "Isolate the holding account where the acquisition funds are parked. Give me the exact routing matrix his lawyers set up for the Cayman transfer." Kendra's fingers flew across her keyboard. Her face was illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screens, highlighting the fierce determination in her dark eyes. "I have it," she said. "They have a script running on a loop. The second the bank registrar updates your status to legally deceased, the system will bypass the holding period and execute the wire. It is a digital tripwire. He did not want to wait even a single day to get his hands on your money." I scoffed. Of course he did not. The Miami cartel was breathing down his neck, and Charles was probably hyperventilating over his impending IRS indictment. But they were about to hit a brick wall. I navigated through layers of encrypted firewalls until I reached the core financial directory. This was where the biometric failsafe lived. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, sleek USB device I always carried on my keychain. It was a military-grade biometric authenticator. I plugged it into the laptop and placed my thumb on the glass sensor. The terminal flashed a prompt demanding a retinal scan. I leaned close to the laptop camera, letting the lens read the unique pattern of my iris. A soft chime echoed in the quiet room, and the screen flooded with the details of the $5.5 billion holding account. "Access granted," I whispered. "Now we build the cage." I explained to Kendra that simply moving the money to another corporate account would not work. Preston had the emergency power of attorney. He could eventually track it down and tie it up in endless litigation, claiming I had set up fraudulent accounts before my death. We needed a structure that was completely impenetrable, a financial black hole, an irrevocable trust. Kendra said, her legal mind instantly grasping the concept. Once the assets go in, the grantor relinquishes all ownership and control. Preston cannot touch it because legally it no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the trust. But who is the trustee? I turned to look at her. "You are." Kendra stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. "You are giving me control of $5.5 billion. I am naming you as the sole co-trustee of a newly activated blind trust," I corrected gently. "I set up the legal framework for this trust 3 years ago, just in case of a hostile corporate takeover. It has been sitting dormant, waiting for funding. I trust you, Kendra. You are the only person who sees this family for what they truly are, and you have the legal expertise to defend this money against any army of lawyers Charles tries to throw at us. We are locking this money down, and we are using it to dismantle them." Kendra did not hesitate for another second. She nodded sharply and gave me the legal designation codes needed to finalize the transfer. I typed furiously, linking the dormant trust to the holding account and authorizing the immediate transfer of the entire $5.5 billion balance. The screen displayed a progress bar that felt agonizingly slow. Every percentage point ticked by like hours. We sat in tense silence, waiting for the inevitable alarm bells to ring on Preston's end. 90%. 95%. Transfer complete. The massive balance in the corporate holding account dropped to zero. In that exact same millisecond, Kendra's monitor lit up with a flurry of red error notifications. Preston's automated wire script had just triggered, realizing the target account was completely empty. The digital tripwire snapped against thin air. Kendra let out a sharp, breathless laugh. "The wire failed," she announced, pointing at the cascading error codes. "Preston's lawyers are getting the automated rejection emails right now. The bank system is reading it as a catastrophic routing error because the funds no longer exist in that jurisdiction. They are going to panic." "Let them panic," I said, closing the laptop with a satisfying click. "Preston thinks he is playing chess, but he just flipped the entire board. The money is safe. The cartel is still waiting for their payment, and Charles is still staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. Now the real fun begins." Kendra leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. A slow, victorious smile spread across her face. "So what is the next step, boss? Do we call the FBI now and watch them drag your husband out of his penthouse in handcuffs?" I shook my head. "No. If we call the FBI now, Preston will just claim it was a terrible boating accident and hire a crisis PR firm to spin the story. I want him to feel safe. I want him to stand up in front of the world and commit to his lies. I want him to dig a hole so deep he can never climb out of it. We are going to let him proceed with his master plan. We are going to let him host my funeral." I turned back to the glowing monitors. Now that the $5.5 billion was secured inside the irrevocable trust, we needed to control the flow of information. I asked Kendra if her software could breach Preston's personal devices. She gave me a look that was entirely insulted. Within 15 minutes, she had mirrored his smartphone directly onto her secondary screen. We had a front row seat to his absolute panic. The digital fallout from the blocked wire transfer was instantaneous. At exactly 8 in the morning, Preston's inbox began flooding with urgent messages from his legal team. The subject lines were written in all caps. "Transaction failed. Routing error. Compliance hold. I watched with immense satisfaction as his outgoing call log lit up like a slot machine. He called his lead attorney 6 times in 3 minutes. When the lawyer finally answered, Kendra routed the audio through her encrypted speakers. Preston was screaming. His normally smooth, charismatic voice was completely unhinged. He demanded to know why the Cayman Island account was sitting empty. The lawyer sounded terrified, explaining that the holding account no longer existed in the bank's central directory. It was as if the money had vanished into thin air. Preston smashed something heavy on his end of the line. We heard glass shattering in the background. He told the lawyer to physically go to the bank and threaten the branch manager with a massive lawsuit if the funds were not released by the end of the day. Then he made the call I was waiting for. He dialed Charles. My father-in-law picked up on the first ring, his voice low and gravelly. Preston sounded like a desperate child begging his father for a solution, telling him the bank must have triggered a manual fraud alert. Charles remained icy and pragmatic. He told Preston to stop acting like a panicked fool. Charles believed the bank was simply stalling because a $5 billion transfer naturally triggered federal oversight protocols. He told Preston they needed to put extreme public pressure on the financial institution. They needed to make the bank look like heartless corporate monsters withholding money from a grieving family. Charles instructed Preston to call the media. He told him to set up a press conference outside our penthouse by noon. Play the heartbroken husband, Charles ordered. Cry for the cameras. Announce a charity in her name. Make the public demand the release of the estate so you can honor your dead wife's legacy. If the bank thinks they are facing a public relations nightmare, they will expedite the compliance check and release the funds. I felt physically sick listening to them strategize my legacy like a public relations stunt. Kendra immediately started typing, pulling up public corporate registries. By noon, every major news network was broadcasting live from the street outside my Manhattan apartment building. Kendra and I watched the live feed on her massive television monitor. Preston walked out of the building wearing a dark, tailored suit. He looked pale and completely devastated. It was an award-winning performance. He held a crumpled tissue in his hand, wiping away non-existent tears as the flashbulbs erupted around him. He stepped up to the cluster of microphones and began speaking in a shaking, broken voice. He talked about how much he loved me. He talked about my brilliance and my dedication to science. He said my tragic accident at sea had shattered his world, but he was determined to keep my dream alive. Then he dropped the ultimate lie. He announced the immediate launch of the Vanessa Global Health Initiative. He claimed he was dedicating my entire fortune to funding pediatric gene therapy for underprivileged communities. The reporters ate it up. They asked sympathetic questions, offering their condolences. Preston looked directly into the camera and pleaded with the financial institutions to release my estate so he could begin saving lives immediately. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug painful half-moons into my palms. He was using sick children as a shield to steal my money. Kendra did not say a word. She was already cross-referencing the name of the foundation in the state registry. Less than 2 minutes later, she pulled up the official incorporation documents. "Take a look at this," she said, pointing to the screen. The Vanessa Global Health Initiative is registered as a non-profit limited liability company. But look at the board of directors. I leaned in. The names meant nothing to me, but Kendra highlighted the listed business address. It was a commercial warehouse located in a highly industrial sector of Miami. Kendra ran the address through a federal database of flagged commercial properties. It was a known front for the exact same money laundering cartel Preston owed the $200 million to. The charity was nothing but a massive washing machine designed to clean my biotech money and funnel it directly into the hands of organized crime. "He is going to use your death to pay off criminals under the guise of philanthropy," Kendra said, shaking her head in pure disgust. "He really thinks he is untouchable. He thinks because he is a wealthy white man in a custom suit, he can just smile for the cameras and walk away with billions. He is about to learn a very hard lesson." I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I looked at the calendar on the wall. Tomorrow was the day Preston had scheduled my grand memorial service. He had rented out one of the largest, most prestigious cathedrals in the city. He invited all of my corporate investors, the board members of my former company, and half the high society elites of New York. He wanted an audience to witness his fake grief and solidify his claim to my empire. "We need to prepare for tomorrow," I told Kendra. "You are going to attend that memorial service. You are going to walk right into the lion's den." Kendra smiled a cold, sharp smile that sent shivers down my spine. She opened a locked drawer in her desk and pulled out a small black velvet box. Inside was a pair of pearl earrings. They looked completely normal, but when she twisted the backing of the left earring, a tiny red light blinked to life. "Military-grade audio and video transmitters," she explained. "My brother works in private security. He gave me these when I first started dealing with Charles and his shady legal contracts. Everything I see and hear tomorrow will be broadcast directly back to this laptop in real time. I am going to get them to confess." Kendra continued, her eyes dark and focused. "Charles cannot help himself. Whenever he sees me, he has to try and put me in my place. I am going to push his buttons until he slips up. We are going to record every single threat, every single racial slur, and every single admission of guilt." I nodded, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the brilliant woman sitting next to me. Tomorrow, my husband and my father-in-law would stand at an altar and lie to the world. They would bury an empty casket and celebrate their victory. But they had no idea the woman they tried to murder was watching their every move, recording every word, and preparing to drop a financial nuclear bomb right on top of their heads. The night passed in a blur of anticipation and cold calculation. While Preston slept comfortably in our penthouse, believing he was on the verge of a massive payday, he had no idea the trap had already snapped shut. The $5.5 billion was now completely insulated within the irrevocable trust. As a tax attorney, Kendra had structured the bylaws so tightly that even if a federal judge wanted to dismantle it, the litigation would take a decade. The money was legally untouchable. Preston was currently fighting a ghost for a treasure chest that no longer existed. I sat on the edge of Kendra's guest bed, staring at the muted television screen. The late-night news stations were still running clips of Preston's afternoon press conference. Seeing him shed those crocodile tears over my supposed death made my stomach turn, but the rage kept me focused. The charitable foundation he announced was the ultimate insult. Using my legacy as a shell company to funnel money to a Miami cartel was a level of depravity I had not anticipated, but it gave us the perfect leverage. The morning of the memorial service arrived with a very heavy gray overcast. Kendra emerged from her bedroom, dressed in a sharply tailored black morning suit. She looked like a woman preparing for battle. She carefully inserted the pearl earrings, twisting the small silver backings until the microscopic transmitters activated. I sat at her command center, sliding a heavy set of noise-canceling headphones over my ears. I tapped a few keys on the laptop and immediately heard the rustle of Kendra's collar against the hidden microphone. The audio feed was crystal clear. We did a quick sound check, verifying that the encrypted stream was recording directly onto my secure hard drive. I looked up at her and gave a firm nod. She grabbed her leather handbag and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the apartment to monitor the collapse of my husband's grand illusion. Through the audio feed, I listened as Kendra's hired car pulled up to the massive stone steps of the cathedral in the Upper East Side. The ambient noise through the earpiece was deafening. The media circus Preston had intentionally manufactured was in full swing. Reporters shouted questions over the flashing of camera shutters. I heard a journalist ask Kendra for a statement regarding the tragic loss of her sister-in-law. She offered a polite but icy no comment and pushed her way through the heavy oak doors of the church. The chaotic street noise instantly faded, replaced by the hushed, solemn echoes of the cathedral interior. Soft organ music played in the background. It was a masterclass in high society hypocrisy. Half the people in that room had actively tried to force me out of the biotech industry before my company went public. Now they were sitting in the pews, dabbing their eyes with expensive silk handkerchiefs, pretending we were lifelong friends. Kendra navigated the crowded aisle, walking toward the designated family seating area near the front altar. I heard the distinct, arrogant voice of Charles before she even reached the second row. He was speaking in a hushed, aggressive tone to a man I recognized as his chief legal counsel. Charles was complaining about the banking delay, calling the compliance officers a bunch of spineless bureaucrats. He assured his lawyer that the judge would sign the final presumptive death order by the end of the business day. He had no idea his words were currently being digitized and stored on a server he could never touch. Kendra took a seat at the edge of the family row, intentionally distancing herself from the rest of the group. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of polite whispering and rustling programs. Then a heavy hush fell over the crowd. Preston walked up to the grand marble podium. He tapped the microphone, and the echoing thud vibrated straight through my headphones. He let out a long, trembling sigh. It was a brilliant theatrical pause. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with manufactured emotion. He told the massive crowd about the first day we met, painting a picture of a love story that never actually existed. He talked about my passion for science and my unwavering dedication to curing genetic diseases. It took every ounce of self-control I had not to throw the laptop across the room. He called me his guiding light, his better half, and his reason for breathing. He claimed that the ocean had taken his heart, but he was determined to channel his devastating grief into the new charitable foundation. He explicitly mentioned the foundation by name, cementing his public connection to the cartel's money laundering front. He was wrapping his own noose right around his neck and broadcasting it to the entire world. As the service concluded and the attendees began to stand, I heard Kendra moving through the crowd. The real test was about to begin. The post-funeral reception was being held in the cathedral's lavish private banquet hall. This was where the masks would slip. This was where Charles and Preston would stop playing the grieving family and start acting like the ruthless predators they truly were. I adjusted my headphones, leaning closer to the monitor. I told Kendra through our secure two-way earpiece to find Charles. I told her to get him alone near the catering area where the ambient noise was lower. The audio feed picked up the clinking of champagne glasses and the low hum of wealthy patrons networking at my funeral. Then the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps approached Kendra. It was actually Preston. He stepped directly into her path, blocking her from reaching his father. The fake tears were completely gone, replaced by the arrogant smirk I had come to despise. When he finally spoke, his tone was dripping with pure venom, and he did not sound remotely sad anymore. "What exactly are you doing here, Kendra?" Preston hissed, leaning in close so the other wealthy guests could not hear. "You know my father does not want you mingling with our corporate investors. You always insist on making people uncomfortable. Where is Wyatt, anyway, hiding in a practice room banging on a piano while the real men handle the family business?" Kendra did not flinch. She took a slow sip of her sparkling water and looked Preston up and down with absolute disgust. "I am attending a funeral, Preston. Though judging by how quickly you are drinking that vintage champagne, you seem to be attending a victory party. You gave a wonderful performance up there, by the way. If the SEC ever investigates your offshore gambling accounts, you could always pivot to an acting career." Preston's face flushed a deep, angry red. Before he could respond, Charles stepped up behind him, placing a heavy hand on his son's shoulder. Charles glared at Kendra, his eyes cold and calculating. He looked at her tailored suit and scoffed loudly enough for a passing waiter to hear. "I told you to stay in the back row," Charles sneered. "You do not belong in the VIP reception, Kendra. You only married into this family because my youngest son is a bleeding heart fool who wanted to rebel against his upbringing. You think putting on a designer suit hides where you came from. You are out of your depth here. Leave before I have security throw you out onto the street." Listening through the earpiece sitting in the apartment miles away, my blood boiled. But Kendra was a professional. She knew exactly how to play him. She let a trace of fake nervousness enter her voice, taking a slight step back. She looked down at the marble floor, playing the intimidated victim flawlessly. "I just wanted to pay my respects," Charles Kendra said, her voice shaking just a little bit. "Vanessa was kind to me. And I know the two of you were pushing her very hard to sign over her corporate voting rights before the accident. I just think it is awfully convenient that she drowned right before the buyout was finalized. Charles took the bait perfectly. His massive ego could not handle being questioned by a woman he viewed as entirely beneath him. He stepped closer to Kendra, backing her into a quiet corner near a massive floral arrangement. The ambient noise of the party faded slightly, allowing the hidden microphones in Kendra's pearl earrings to pick up every single syllable he spoke. "Listen to me, you arrogant little diversity hire!" Charles growled, his voice dropping into a menacing whisper. "I cleaned up Vanessa because she forgot her place. She thought her little science project and her new money made her untouchable. She was an obstacle standing in the way of my family legacy. If you and Wyatt do not sign those corporate transfer papers by Friday, I will not hesitate to clean up your side of the family next. Accidents happen on the water every day, Kendra. Do not test me." I stopped breathing. Sitting in the dark apartment, I stared at the audio waveform recording on the laptop screen. It was perfect. It was a crystal clear, legally admissible death threat, and a direct confession to my murder. Charles had just handed us the absolute destruction of his entire life on a silver platter. Kendra maintained her terrified act, nodding quickly and hurrying away from Charles and Preston. She slipped toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the banquet hall where the private family business was about to take place. Through the earpiece, I heard Preston calling for the attention of the remaining core family members and my parents. He announced that the estate lawyer was ready to read the final will and testament in the private rectory. My heart ached as I heard my mother's voice. She sounded so small and broken, asking Preston if they really had to do this right now. She was still weeping for her daughter, and Preston was dragging her into a legal proceeding before I was even in the ground. Preston put on his gentle fake voice, wrapping an arm around my sobbing mother and guiding her into the back room. Kendra slipped in quietly, standing near the heavy velvet curtains in the back. The lawyer cleared his throat. He was a sleazy corporate fixer Charles kept on retainer specifically for burying dirty money. He pulled a thick stack of papers from his leather briefcase and began reading the forged document Preston had created. According to the fake will, I had revoked all previous trusts and legal arrangements just days before my death. I supposedly left 100% of my assets, including the entire $5.5 billion biotech payout, directly to Preston. But the cruelty did not stop there. The lawyer read a specific clause that explicitly disinherited my parents. It stated that I felt they had become a financial burden and I was cutting off all their stipends. "That is a lie," my father shouted, his voice cracking with grief and anger. "Vanessa would never write those words. She loved us. She bought the house we live in so we could retire in peace. This document is a complete fabrication." Preston dropped the grieving husband act instantly. The room fell dead silent as he looked at my parents with eyes as cold as a shark. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his inner suit jacket pocket and tossed it onto the dark wood table in front of my father. "Vanessa was greedy," Preston said, his voice echoing in the small room. "She secretly leveraged the deed to your house to fund her company years ago. The property technically belongs to her corporate estate now, and since I am the sole beneficiary of that estate, I am liquidating it. You have 30 days to pack up your things and vacate the property." My mother let out a horrific, agonizing wail. She collapsed against my father, sobbing uncontrollably. They had just lost their only child, and now their son-in-law was throwing them out onto the street. My father lunged across the table, grabbing Preston by the lapels of his expensive suit, but Charles immediately snapped his fingers. Two massive private security guards stepped out from the shadows and forcefully ripped my father away, shoving him hard against the wall. "Escort them out," Charles ordered, waving his hand dismissively. "This is a private family matter now. We have no more use for them." I listened to my parents being physically dragged out of the rectory, crying and begging for answers. A single tear rolled down my cheek, hitting the keyboard of the laptop. I wiped it away violently. That would be the last tear I ever shed for this family. Preston and Charles had taken their cruelty to a level I could barely comprehend. They felt invincible. They felt like gods who could crush anyone beneath their expensive leather shoes. As the private room cleared out, I heard Preston speaking to the corrupt lawyer. He confirmed the wire transfer would be forced through the bank by tomorrow morning now that the public pressure was on. He then told his father he was heading back to our penthouse early. He claimed he needed to rest, but I knew exactly what he was really doing. He was going to celebrate. He was going to bring his hidden mistress into my home, sleep in my bed, and give her the diamonds from my safe. I leaned into the microphone, connecting me to Kendra. "Get out of there," I whispered, my voice hard as steel. "Let them have their victory tonight. Let him go home and open that wall safe. Tomorrow morning we are walking into that boardroom and we are going to burn them alive." Kendra slipped out the side door of the cathedral, leaving the corrupt family members to their twisted celebration. By the time she returned to her apartment, I had already transitioned my laptop to a new live feed. When we first bought the penthouse, I insisted on installing state-of-the-art hidden security cameras in every room to protect my highly sensitive corporate research files. Preston always hated those cameras, claiming they felt intrusive, but he never knew I had hardwired the feed directly to a private offshore server. As Kendra took off her coat and poured us both a massive cup of black coffee, we sat back and watched the screens like we were watching a hit television show. The season finale of My Husband's Miserable Life was about to air. Kendra pointed to the screen showing the primary bedroom. The wall safe behind the modern art painting was shut tight. She asked me if I really thought he was going to open it tonight. I smiled a cold, hard smile and told her it was absolutely guaranteed. Preston was a creature of massive ego and predictable habits. He had a mistress, a cheap social climber he had been seeing for 6 months. He had promised her my $20 million diamond necklace the second I was officially out of the picture. What he did not know was that while he was busy staging his fake crying routine for the press conference yesterday afternoon, I took a little detour. I still had the master biometric override for our private elevator. I slipped into the penthouse undetected, emptied my jewelry from the safe, and left a very specific message in its place. Just past midnight, the heavy front doors of the penthouse swung open. Preston stumbled in, loosening his black silk tie. Right behind him was the mistress, giggling and holding a bottle of my favorite vintage wine. Watching another woman walk into my home wearing one of my expensive silk robes made my jaw clench, but I kept my breathing steady. Preston poured them both a glass and started bragging. We could hear every word through the high-definition audio feed. He boasted about how brilliant his performance at the funeral had been. He told her the $5.5 billion would hit his offshore account by tomorrow afternoon, and they would be taking a private jet to the south of France to celebrate. She kissed his cheek and immediately asked about the diamonds. Preston smiled a greasy, arrogant smile and led her into the primary bedroom. He walked over to the modern art piece and swung it open, revealing the heavy steel door of the wall safe. He punched in the security code. The electronic lock chirped, and he pulled the heavy door open. He reached his hand inside, expecting to pull out a velvet box filled with flawless diamonds. Instead, his hand grabbed nothing but empty air. He froze. We watched his broad shoulders stiffen in absolute shock. He leaned closer, shoving his entire arm into the empty steel box, frantically feeling the bare walls. Then he noticed the single piece of thick white stationery sitting right in the center. He pulled the note out with trembling fingers. From the angle of the hidden camera, I could see his eyes darting back and forth as he read the handwritten words. "The bottom of the ocean is cold, Preston, but not as cold as your smile." The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick ghost. He dropped the piece of paper as if it had burned his skin. He stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the expensive rug and crashing hard into the bedside table. A glass lamp shattered on the hardwood floor, but he did not even flinch. The mistress screamed, asking him what was wrong, but he just stared at the piece of paper on the floor, hyperventilating. His chest heaved wildly, and for a second I thought he was going to have a genuine heart attack. "Get out!" he screamed, suddenly turning his panic onto the mistress. He grabbed her by the arm, roughly shoving her toward the bedroom door. She protested, whining about the diamonds, but he was completely unhinged. He pushed her out of the apartment, tossing her purse into the hallway and slamming the heavy door, locking the deadbolt. Left alone in the massive penthouse, he began pacing like a trapped animal, pulling at his hair. He grabbed his cell phone from his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he dropped it twice before finally dialing a number. Since Kendra was still mirroring his phone, we heard the dial tone ring through our speakers. Charles answered, sounding groggy and irritated. Preston was practically hyperventilating into the receiver. He told his father my diamonds were gone. He told him about the note. He screamed that I must have survived the fall and that I was coming for him. Charles was silent for a long, terrifying moment. Then his voice cracked like a whip over the phone line. He called his son a paranoid coward. He insisted that I was dead. Charles theorized that one of my parents must have sneaked into the apartment during the funeral reception to steal the jewelry and left the note to mess with his head. He refused to believe a woman could survive a drop into the freezing ocean in the middle of the night. Charles demanded Preston stop acting like a terrified child. But the fear in Preston was real, and it was contagious. Charles knew the longer they waited, the more complicated things would get. The Miami cartel was running out of patience, and the IRS was breathing down his neck. Charles barked an order into the phone. He told Preston to call the corporate secretary immediately and schedule an emergency board of directors meeting for 8 in the morning. He said they were going to force the bank compliance officers to sit in that room and manually approve the wire transfer of the $5.5 billion in front of all the major shareholders. They were going to end this tonight. Preston agreed, his voice still cracking with absolute terror. He hung up the phone and slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor staring at the empty safe. I closed the laptop feed, letting the screen go black. The look of sheer horror on my husband's face was deeply satisfying, but it was only the appetizer. Tomorrow morning, he would walk into that corporate boardroom expecting to solidify his massive theft. He would be surrounded by the most powerful people in the city, and that was exactly where I wanted him. I turned to Kendra, who was already packing her legal briefcases with the printed audit reports and the irrevocable trust documents. We did not need to sleep. We had an empire to burn down, and the match was already lit. But before the 8 o'clock board meeting could begin, Preston had one more piece of cruel business to attend to. We had stayed awake the entire night, finalizing the legal traps and printing the audit trails. By 6 in the morning, we were dressed in immaculate power suits and sitting in the back of a rented black SUV with heavily tinted windows. We were parked directly across the street from the towering glass skyscraper that housed Charles's corporate headquarters. Through the encrypted audio feed, Kendra was still monitoring my husband's phone, and we intercepted a message from his corrupt lawyer. Preston had demanded my grieving parents come to the corporate office at 7 in the morning for the formal recorded reading of the will. He wanted to force them to sign a legal acknowledgement waiving their right to contest the estate before the board members arrived. It was a calculated, deeply malicious move. He knew they were financially vulnerable and emotionally destroyed. He wanted to break them completely so they would never pose a threat to his new empire. Kendra and I sat in the dark SUV listening as the audio feed picked up the sound of my parents walking into the plush corporate antechamber. My mother's voice sounded incredibly frail. She asked why they had to be summoned at such an ungodly hour when they had just buried their daughter yesterday. The lawyer did not offer any condolences. He simply instructed them to sit down at the heavy glass conference table. A moment later, the door clicked open and Preston walked in. He immediately deployed his sickening charm. He offered my mother a cup of coffee and placed a comforting hand on my father's shoulder. Listening to his soft, sympathetic tone made my blood run absolutely cold. The lawyer cleared his throat and officially commenced the formal reading of the fabricated document. The preliminary announcement at the church had been cruel, but this was the legally binding execution. The lawyer read the dense legal jargon stating that due to unforeseen financial liabilities, I had restructured my entire estate 48 hours before my tragic accident. The forged will explicitly transferred 100% of my assets, including my intellectual property, the biotech buyout funds, and all real estate holdings directly to Preston. Then came the fatal blow. The lawyer read a specific clause detailing the revocation of the life estate I had granted my parents. It stated that their home, the house I had purchased for them in full 5 years ago, was now considered a liquid asset of the corporate holding company. Preston sighed deeply, an award-winning performance of manufactured regret. He slid a thick manila envelope across the glass table toward my father. He offered them a fake, sympathetic smile that I could perfectly picture in my mind. "I am so incredibly sorry," Preston said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I tried to find a way around this, but Vanessa left behind a tremendous amount of hidden corporate debt. The board of directors is forcing my hand. I have to liquidate the property to satisfy her outstanding loans. Inside that envelope is the official eviction notice. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. I know this is hard, but it is what Vanessa signed into law." My father slammed his fist onto the table. The sharp crack echoed through the audio feed. "You are a liar," my father shouted. "My daughter did not have hidden debt. She just sold her company for billions. She would never throw us out onto the street. You forced her to sign this, or you forged it yourself. I will take this to the Supreme Court before I let you take the house she gave us." Preston's sympathetic facade instantly vanished. His voice dropped into a cold, corporate monotone. "You can try to fight it," he said, "but I have an army of the best litigators in the country on retainer. If you challenge this will, I will drag the litigation out for 10 years. You will go bankrupt paying legal fees, and I will still take the house in the end. Or you can sign the acknowledgement paper right now, and I will personally write you a check for $50,000 to help you relocate. That is my final offer. Take the money and walk away, or leave with absolutely nothing." The silence that followed was agonizing. I heard my mother softly crying, begging my father just to sign it so they could leave this horrible place. The sound of a pen scratching against paper confirmed that my husband had won his cruel little game. He had successfully bullied 2 grieving parents into signing away their only remaining security. The lawyer smugly thanked them, and Preston told security to escort them out the back exit so they would not cross paths with the arriving board members. In the back of the SUV, I squeezed my eyes shut. My hands were trembling with a rage so intense it felt like a physical weight in my chest. Kendra placed a steadying hand on my arm. She looked at me with a fierce, unyielding expression. "Let him think he has won," she said quietly. "He just committed federal fraud and extortion on a recorded line. We have everything we need." I opened my eyes and looked out the tinted window. It was 7:45. Black town cars and luxury sedans were pulling up to the front entrance of the skyscraper. The most powerful corporate executives, shareholders, and board members were walking through the revolving glass doors. They were arriving to manually authorize the transfer of $5.5 billion into Preston's offshore accounts. A few moments later, Charles arrived. He stepped out of his chauffeured vehicle looking tense but aggressively arrogant, barking orders at his assistant. He was desperate for this money to clear his own impending federal indictments. They were all gathering in the main boardroom on the 50th floor. The trap was fully set, and the prey had voluntarily walked right into the center of it. I checked the secure encrypted connection on my laptop, ensuring the audio and video files were queued up perfectly. I looked down at the immaculate crimson power suit I was wearing. It was the exact same color as the blood my husband had tried to spill in the ocean. I grabbed my leather briefcase and gave Kendra a sharp nod. It was time to show my husband that the dead do not stay buried forever. We opened the heavy doors of the SUV and stepped out into the crisp morning air, ready to execute the most brutal corporate takeover in the history of the city. The crisp morning air hit my face as I stepped out of the SUV. The towering glass and steel structure of Charles's corporate headquarters loomed above us, catching the early morning sunlight. This building was the crown jewel of his real estate empire. It was the physical manifestation of his wealth and his massive ego. Today, it was going to become his tomb. Kendra walked beside me, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete plaza. She carried the heavy leather briefcase, containing the irrevocable trust documents and the financial audit trails that proved Charles was entirely insolvent. I adjusted the lapels of my crimson power suit. It was a bold choice, a vibrant, unapologetic red, the exact color of the blood my husband had hoped to see spilling into the ocean. We approached the massive revolving glass doors. The lobby was expansive, lined with imported Italian marble, and staffed by a dozen high-end security guards. As we walked toward the private executive elevators, a senior security director stepped into our path, holding up a hand. He recognized Kendra from previous family disputes, and his face hardened. He told us we were not authorized to be on the premises and threatened to call the police if we did not leave immediately. Kendra did not even break her stride. She smoothly reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a stack of court-stamped documents. She shoved them directly into the security director's chest. She informed him in a voice that echoed through the cavernous lobby that as the sole trustee of the new holding company, she now owned a majority stake in the building itself. She told him he was currently speaking to his new boss, and if he did not step aside, he would be clearing out his desk before lunch. The guard looked down at the official seals on the paperwork, his face draining of color. He stepped aside and we walked onto the private elevator. As the polished steel doors slid shut, Kendra pressed the button for the 50th floor. The elevator shot upward in smooth silence. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with pure concentrated adrenaline. We were not just walking into a corporate meeting. We were walking into a heavily fortified bunker filled with the most powerful and corrupt people in the city. But we were bringing the ultimate weapon. On the 49th floor, the elevator stopped briefly. The doors opened to reveal a staging area where 6 men and women in dark suits were waiting. They were federal agents. Kendra had quietly forwarded the encrypted ledgers linking Preston's new charity to the Miami money laundering cartel directly to a contact she had at the FBI. Special Agent Harris, a tall, no-nonsense man, stepped onto the elevator with his team. He gave me a curt professional nod. We had them dead to rights on federal racketeering and wire fraud charges. The agents loaded their weapons and stood quietly behind us as the elevator resumed its climb to the top floor. When the doors opened on the 50th floor, we stepped into a luxurious reception area. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the primary boardroom, I could see everything unfolding. The room was packed. Over 24 of the major corporate shareholders, the same wealthy hypocrites who had been dabbing their eyes at my funeral yesterday, were seated around the massive mahogany table. At the head of the table sat Preston. He looked absolutely atrocious. His skin was a sickly gray and dark purple bags hung heavy under his eyes. I knew exactly why he looked like a walking corpse. He was still haunted by what happened last night in our penthouse. He had brought his mistress home expecting to shower her with my diamonds, only to find an empty safe and a handwritten note reminding him of the freezing ocean. The psychological terror had clearly broken him. His hands were trembling so violently he had to keep them pressed flat against the glass table just to hide the shaking. Standing right behind Preston was Charles. My father-in-law looked like a cornered predator. He was leaning aggressively over the table, shouting at a nervous-looking man in a cheap suit who represented the bank compliance department. Through the thick glass, I could faintly hear the muffled sound of Charles barking orders. He was demanding a manual override of the banking system. He argued that the funds were being illegally withheld due to an automated glitch, and that the board was prepared to file a billion-dollar lawsuit against the bank if the transfer to the Cayman Islands was not initiated within the hour. The compliance officer was sweating profusely, frantically typing on his laptop, trying to explain that the holding account no longer existed in their directory. The board members murmured in agreement with Charles. They were greedy. They wanted the massive stock bump that would come from the successful acquisition, and they wanted the positive public relations of Preston's fake charity. They were completely blinded by their own greed. Charles slammed his fist on the table, demanding the compliance officer pull up the manual override authorization form. The terrified bank employee complied, sliding a printed document across the polished mahogany. Charles pointed to the signature line and slapped Preston's shoulder. He ordered his son to sign the document in his capacity as the sole inheritor and acting chief executive. Preston stared at the paper. He picked up the heavy gold fountain pen. I watched a drop of sweat roll down his pale forehead and land on the document. He was moments away from committing the final act of wire fraud. He uncapped the pen and lowered the gold nib toward the paper. Now, I whispered to Kendra. Kendra pushed open the heavy double-glass doors of the boardroom. The hinges swung silently, but the sudden movement caught the attention of the security guard standing inside. Before he could speak, Special Agent Harris and the FBI task force flooded into the room, fanning out along the back wall, blocking the only exit. The low hum of corporate chatter instantly died. The room went dead silent. The board members froze in their leather chairs, looking back in absolute confusion. Charles stood up straight, his face turning a furious shade of red, demanding to know who had authorized federal agents to interrupt a private corporate proceeding. Then I walked through the doors. I stepped into the center of the room, the crimson suit cutting through the sea of gray and black like a warning siren. The silence in the boardroom deepened into something physical. It felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. A female board member in the second row gasped, dropping her coffee cup onto the carpet. Preston slowly lifted his head. When his eyes locked onto mine, the pen slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the glass table. His jaw went completely slack. He looked at me as if a demon had just crawled out of the depths of hell to drag him down. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic broken wheeze escaped his lips. I walked slowly toward the head of the table, my heels echoing like gunshots in the silent room. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from my husband. I looked at his terrified face and offered him a slow, deliberate smile. I told him he looked a little pale and asked if he had a rough night sleeping in my bed. Preston could not form a single coherent word. His mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. His eyes darted wildly around the room as if searching for an escape route that did not exist. Behind him, Charles was the first to break the paralyzing silence. His face contorted in a mix of absolute shock and primal rage. He lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the mahogany table, demanding to know how I was standing there. He screamed at the federal agents, asking why they were protecting a dead woman who was clearly orchestrating a massive corporate fraud. Special Agent Harris did not even blink, simply resting his hand casually over his holstered weapon and telling Charles to sit down and remain completely silent. I did not look at Charles. My eyes remained locked on my husband. The man who had promised to love and protect me, the man who had pushed me into the freezing ocean without a second thought, was now trembling so violently his knees buckled. He collapsed back into his heavy leather executive chair. The board members were in a state of absolute uproar. Questions were being shouted across the room. The bank compliance officer had gone completely white, realizing he was sitting in the middle of a massive federal crime scene. I raised my hand and the room slowly quieted down. They were all waiting for me to explain how a woman whose funeral they had just attended yesterday was now standing in their boardroom wearing a red suit and flanked by the FBI. I told the board members I would explain everything, but first they needed to understand exactly who they were about to give $5.5 billion to. I pulled a small encrypted flash drive from my pocket. I walked over to the corporate presentation console at the front of the room. I plugged the drive in and typed in my master override password. The massive high-definition projector screen covering the entire back wall hummed to life. I told them this was footage from the hidden security cameras inside my penthouse, recorded at exactly 2:00 this morning. The screen flickered and the crisp night vision footage filled the room. Everyone in the boardroom watched as a giant digital version of Preston paced frantically back and forth across the penthouse living room. He looked completely unhinged. He was clutching the handwritten note I had left in the empty safe. Through the crystal-clear audio feed, the board members could hear him hyperventilating. A few moments later, the private elevator doors opened on the screen. Charles stormed into the apartment wearing a heavy winter coat over his pajamas. He looked furious. On the video, Preston ran over to his father, shoving the handwritten note into his chest. Preston was having a full meltdown. His voice was high and hysterical. He screamed that I was alive. He babbled uncontrollably about how the bottom of the ocean did not kill me and how I had somehow bypassed his security to steal the $20 million in diamonds. Preston grabbed his own hair, pulling at the roots, terrified that I was going to contact the authorities. He cried about the Miami cartel, telling Charles that if the $5.5 billion did not hit the offshore account, the cartel was going to send hitmen to the penthouse and chop them into pieces. Watching this in the boardroom, the wealthy shareholders gasped. Several of them covered their mouths in horror as the reality of the money laundering scheme was laid bare for everyone to hear. On the screen, Charles snatched the note from Preston's trembling hands. He read it and crumpled it into a tight ball, throwing it on the floor. Charles stepped forward and slapped his son across the face. The sharp crack of skin on skin echoed loudly through the silent boardroom. In the video, Charles pointed a thick finger at Preston's chest, calling him a pathetic, paranoid coward. He yelled that ghosts do not exist and that nobody survives a drop into international waters in the middle of the night. He insisted the note was just a cruel prank played by Kendra or my grieving parents trying to extort them. Then Charles delivered the final nail in their collective coffin. He laid out the entire criminal conspiracy on crystal-clear, high-definition video. He told Preston to stop crying and act like a man. He demanded they hold an emergency board of directors meeting first thing in the morning. He explicitly outlined their plan to intimidate the bank compliance officer into manually releasing the $5.5 billion. He stated clearly that once the money was safely routed to the Cayman Islands, the cartel would be paid, his massive IRS tax debts would be wiped clean, and they would be legally untouchable. Charles grabbed Preston by the collar of his shirt, shaking him violently, and ordered him to play the role of the grieving husband one last time. I tapped the console and the screen went black. The silence in the boardroom was heavier than it had been when I first walked in. The corporate executives who had been ready to hand over my life's work just 5 minutes ago were now staring at Charles and Preston with unadulterated disgust. The bank compliance officer frantically slammed his laptop shut, distancing himself entirely from the fraudulent authorization forms on the table. He looked like he was about to be physically sick. I turned my back to the dark screen and looked at the two men who had tried to destroy me. Charles was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his custom-tailored suit. He looked around the room, realizing that every single one of his wealthy allies had just watched him confess to orchestrating a massive financial crime and covering up my attempted murder. There was nowhere left to run. There were no more lies he could spin. "You are a dead man walking," Charles said, my voice carrying clearly across the massive room. "You thought you could push me into the dark and steal my empire to cover up your own pathetic failures. You thought I was just a naive scientist who would quietly disappear. But you forgot one very important detail. When you build an empire from the ground up, you learn exactly how to protect it." Charles clenched his fists, stepping forward as if he was going to attack me right there in front of the federal agents. But Preston was completely broken. My husband slumped forward, resting his head on the glass table, and began to sob. It was not the fake theatrical crying he had used at the press conference or the memorial service. It was the deep, ugly sobbing of a man who realized his life was entirely over. He had lost the money, he had lost his freedom, and the Miami cartel was still waiting for their payment. The panic he felt last night in the penthouse was nothing compared to the absolute crushing reality of this moment. And I was going to make sure he felt every single second of it. Charles refuses to accept defeat. He straightens his tie, his face morphing from shock back into that familiar, sneering arrogance. He looks at the board of directors and then points a shaking finger at me. He loudly declares that the video is a complete fabrication, an AI deepfake designed to manipulate the stock price and ruin the merger. He tells the room that I am clearly suffering from a severe psychotic break and that I staged my own disappearance to extort the family. He demands that Special Agent Harris arrest me immediately for corporate terrorism and wire fraud. Agent Harris does not even flinch. He simply crosses his arms and watches Charles unravel. I let Charles shout until his voice goes hoarse. I want every single executive in this room to see exactly how pathetic the great real estate titan really is when he loses his grip on power. When Charles finally runs out of breath, gasping and red-faced Kendra steps forward from my side. She walks right up to the edge of the heavy glass table. She does not look at Preston, who is still weeping into his hands. She looks directly into the eyes of the man who has spent years calling her a diversity hire and mocking her intelligence. Kendra lifts her heavy leather briefcase and unlatches it. She pulls out a massive stack of thick-bound financial documents and slams them down onto the mahogany table. The loud thud echoes through the silent room, making several board members jump. Kendra announces that there is no deepfake and there is no corporate terrorism. She tells the board that she is the legally appointed co-trustee of my irrevocable trust. And then she drops the financial nuclear bomb we spent all night preparing. She looks at Charles and smiles a cold, terrifying smile. She tells him that over the past 48 hours, while he was busy planning a fake funeral and trying to steal my money, the trust was actively working. Kendra explains that she used her specialized access to contact all of Charles' primary creditors. She knew about his impending IRS indictment for massive tax evasion, and she knew his holding company was bleeding cash. So the irrevocable trust used $1 billion of my liquid assets to quietly purchase every single piece of defaulted debt Charles owed. The color completely drains from Charles' face. His mouth opens but no sound comes out. The board members begin whispering frantically among themselves, realizing the catastrophic magnitude of what Kendra is saying. She continues, her voice cutting through the whispers like a newly sharpened blade. She explains that my trust bought his commercial mortgages, his personal lines of credit, and the massive loans he used to float his failing construction projects. We bought it all for pennies on the dollar, because his creditors were desperate to offload the toxic assets before the federal government seized his empire. I step forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Kendra. I look Charles dead in the eye and deliver the final crushing blow. I tell him that I am no longer just his daughter-in-law, I am his supreme creditor. I own the debt on this very skyscraper we are standing in. I own the mortgage on his sprawling estate in the Hamptons. I own the financing on his private jet and his fleet of luxury cars. I tell him that because he is in severe default on every single one of those loans, I am initiating an immediate hostile foreclosure right here in the boardroom. Charles stumbles backward, hitting the edge of a leather chair. He shakes his head, muttering that it is impossible, that the paperwork takes months to clear. Kendra taps the thick stack of documents on the table and tells him the expedited legal filings were time-stamped by a federal judge at 6:00 this morning. She formally notifies him that his entire empire is now the legal property of my trust, and his personal accounts have been entirely frozen. He is completely, unequivocally bankrupt. The bank compliance officer sitting at the table frantically raises his hand, his voice shaking. He officially states for the record that the bank is withdrawing all support for the corporate merger and nullifying the wire transfer authorization. He tells Special Agent Harris that the bank will fully cooperate with the federal investigation and hand over all of Preston's forged documents. The wealthy shareholders who had backed Charles for decades suddenly scramble, pushing their chairs back and physically distancing themselves from the two men. Nobody wants to be standing near the blast radius of a federal racketeering charge. Preston lifts his head from the table. His eyes are red and swollen, his face wet with tears and sweat. He looks at the frozen, terrified face of his father and realizes that there is no billionaire empire left to save him. The cartel is still owed $200 million, and the money is gone. Preston does the only thing a coward knows how to do. He turns on the person standing next to him. He points a shaking finger at Charles and screams that the murder plot was entirely his father's idea. Preston cries out to Agent Harris, swearing that Charles forced him to push me off the yacht and threatened to kill him if he did not comply. Charles snaps. The betrayal from his own son shatters whatever little sanity he has left. He roars like a wounded animal and lunges across the space between them. He tackles Preston to the floor of the pristine corporate boardroom. the two men grapple violently, knocking over expensive leather chairs and smashing coffee cups. Charles punches Preston in the face, screaming that he is a useless, weak failure who ruined everything. Preston fights back, clawing at his father's face and kicking wildly. It is a pathetic, disgusting display of two greedy men destroying each other. Agent Harris barks an order, and the FBI tactical team moves in. They pull the two men apart, throwing them face down onto the expensive carpet. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoes through the room. Harris reads them their Miranda rights, listing a long, terrifying string of federal charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, forgery, and racketeering. Preston continues to sob uncontrollably, begging for a plea deal, offering to give the FBI everything he knows about the Miami cartel. Charles just lies there, staring blankly at the floor, his massive ego finally shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. I stand over them, looking down at the men who thought my life was nothing more than a stepping stone for their greed. I do not feel any pity. I do not feel any lingering affection. I just feel an overwhelming sense of absolute liberation. The heavy boardroom doors are held open by the federal agents, and they drag my husband and my father-in-law out into the hallway. The board members watch in stunned, terrified silence as the architects of their corporate future are taken away in chains. The empire has officially fallen, and I am the only one left standing. The heavy gold pen slipped from Preston's trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the thick glass table. It rolled slowly, stopping right at the edge. He did not try to catch it. He could not move. He was staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes, looking exactly like a man who had just seen a ghost. His jaw hung slack, and the color had drained so completely from his face that his skin perfectly matched his crisp white dress shirt. Charles, the ruthless titan of real estate who always commanded every room he entered, was completely paralyzed. He gripped the back of Preston's leather chair, his knuckles turning stark white. He tried to speak, but his throat only produced a pathetic, stammering sound. He looked at me and then looked at the heavily armed FBI agents flanking the boardroom door, unable to process the absolute reality collapsing around him. I did not yell. I did not need to raise my voice. True power is perfectly quiet. I walked calmly down the length of the massive mahogany boardroom table. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The wealthy shareholders and corporate board members parted like the ocean. They pulled their chairs back, pressing themselves against the glass walls, entirely terrified of the woman they had officially buried just 24 hours ago. I reached the head of the table. The bank compliance officer was sitting there, sweating profusely, his hands hovering over his open laptop. I looked down at him and politely asked him to step aside. He scrambled out of his seat, nearly tripping over his own feet to get away from the center of the room. I reached into the pocket of my crimson suit and pulled out my smartphone. I picked up the primary presentation cable from the console and plugged it directly into my device. The massive high-definition projector screen covering the back wall flickered to life, mirroring my phone screen. I turned to face the room. I told the board of directors that they had all gathered here today to mourn my tragic accident at sea and to authorize the transfer of my $5.5 billion estate to my grieving husband. I told them that before any money changed hands, they needed to see exactly how that tragic accident actually happened. I tapped the play button on my screen. The boardroom was instantly filled with the roaring sound of dual marine engines and the howling wind of the open ocean. The video quality was exceptional. The micro camera I had integrated into the lapel of my evening gown captured the ambient light of the luxury yacht perfectly. On the giant screen, the board members saw the sprawling teak deck and the dark, endless expanse of international waters. Then Preston stepped into the frame. He looked handsome and entirely lethal. The deck lights illuminated his sharp jawline and his perfect hair. But it was his smile that made several people in the boardroom gasp aloud. It was not a smile of love. It was the cold, calculated smirk of a predator who was about to secure his ultimate prize. He leaned in, incredibly close to the hidden camera. The microphone picked up his voice with terrifying clarity over the sound of the wind. Enjoy your swim with the sharks. The words echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom. On the screen, Preston's hands violently shoved forward. The camera jerked wildly, capturing the chaotic blur of the yacht railing rushing past. But right before the lens plunged into the darkness, the microphone picked up one more distinct sound. It was the deep, booming laugh of Charles, followed by the sharp clinking of ice cubes in his martini glass. He was drinking and laughing while he watched his son hurl me into the freezing abyss. The video exploded into a frenzy of dark water and white foam. The heavy, crushing sound of the ocean completely engulfed the room. The audio captured my frantic, muffled gasping as I fought my way to the surface, choking on salt water. I let the video run for another 15 seconds, allowing the board members to listen to my desperate struggle for survival in the pitch-black water. Then I reached down and paused the playback. The massive screen froze on a terrifying image of the black rolling waves. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was so quiet I could hear the hum of the projector cooling fan. A senior female board member, sitting in the second row, covered her mouth with both hands, tears of sheer horror welling in her eyes. The bank compliance officer backed away until his shoulders hit the wall, looking like he was going to be physically sick. The wealthy elites who had offered Preston their deepest condolences yesterday were now staring at him as if he were a monster covered in blood. Preston finally broke his paralysis. He shook his head frantically, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. He pointed a trembling finger at the giant screen, and his voice cracked in a high-pitched panic. He screamed that the video was a fabrication. He yelled that it was a highly advanced computer-generated fake designed to destroy the corporate merger. He looked frantically at the board members, begging them not to believe their own eyes. He claimed I was a vindictive psychopath who was trying to frame him for a terrible accident. I calmly walked around the edge of the table until I was standing directly in front of my husband. I looked down into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. I told him that the FBI Cyber Division had already extracted the raw, encrypted file directly from the offshore server it was streamed to. I told him there was an unbreakable digital chain of custody that proved the video was completely authentic. I told him that his performance as the grieving widower was officially canceled. Kendra stepped forward, standing tall and commanding. She looked at the terrified shareholders and delivered the final legal warning. She informed the board that if they proceeded to authorize the transfer of the $5.5 billion to Preston, they would be officially funding a shell corporation tied to a Miami money laundering cartel. She told them that Special Agent Harris and his team were currently securing the building, and anyone who signed that release form would be indicted as a co-conspirator to federal racketeering and attempted murder. The reaction was instantaneous. The board members scrambled away from the table. They shouted over each other, demanding that their legal counsel immediately sever all ties with Charles and his holding company. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the sinking ship. They looked at Preston with absolute revulsion. The bank compliance officer reached over and physically tore the printed wire authorization form in half, tossing the pieces onto the floor. Preston watched the torn pieces of paper flutter to the carpet. His $5.5 billion payday was completely gone. His cartel debt was still active, and the FBI was standing right behind him. The ghost he thought he had buried at the bottom of the ocean was now standing over him, holding the keys to his absolute destruction. Preston dropped to the carpet. His suit wrinkled as he frantically gathered the torn pieces of the bank authorization form. His hands were shaking so violently he could not even hold the jagged edges together. He looked up at the board members, twisting his face in pure desperation, and screamed that they were being brainwashed. He yelled that the video was a highly sophisticated AI deepfake engineered by corporate rivals to destroy our merger. He begged them to manually override the compliance hold, claiming the cartel would murder him if the money did not clear by noon. He was literally groveling on the floor. Charles looked down at his son with absolute disgust. The mighty real estate titan watched his own flesh and blood completely unravel in front of his most important investors. Charles kicked Preston's hands away from the torn paper, telling him to stop acting like a terrified child. Charles straightened his custom silk tie, attempting to salvage whatever shred of authority he had left. He looked at Special Agent Harris and then turned his cold eyes toward me. Charles declared that he was terminating the meeting immediately. He stated that even if the bank froze the wire transfer, he was still the primary shareholder. Charles puffed out his chest and raised his voice. He claimed he had an army of corporate attorneys waiting on standby, and he would tie my trust funds up in federal litigation for the next 20 years. He boldly stated his real estate empire was entirely insulated from my biotech money. He bragged that he had billions of dollars in commercial properties, and he would simply liquidate his own assets to pay off the cartel and settle his federal tax disputes. He sneered at me, calling me a naive little scientist. He thought his empire was bulletproof. That was the exact moment Kendra stepped forward. She did not flinch under his aggressive glare. She simply unlatched her leather briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of bound financial documents. She raised the thick papers high into the air and slammed them down onto the center of the mahogany table with a deafening crack. The sound echoed like a gunshot, cutting off Charles mid-sentence. Kendra looked directly into the eyes of the man who had spent years mocking her African-American heritage at every family dinner. She offered him a smile so cold it made my blood run cold. Kendra told Charles that he was now completely wrong about his precious real estate empire. She informed the terrified board of directors that she was the sole legally appointed Kyo trustee of my newly activated irrevocable trust. She explained that while Charles and Preston were busy picking out flower arrangements for my fake funeral and practicing their fake tears, she had been working around the clock. Over the past 48 hours, Kendra had used her specialized legal access to quietly contact every single one of Charles' primary creditors. She knew about his impending federal indictment for massive tax evasion, and his holding company was bleeding cash. With the $5.5 billion fully secured inside the trust, Kendra had authorization to make massive investments. She explained to the silent boardroom that the trust had systematically deployed $1 billion in liquid cash over the weekend. Charles' face began to lose its color as Kendra laid out the exact details of his financial ruin. She told him his creditors were absolutely desperate to offload his toxic assets before the government seized his portfolio. So the trust bought his commercial mortgages. We bought his personal lines of credit. We bought the massive underwater loans he used to float his many failing construction projects. We bought every single debt you owe, Charles Kendra, said her voice echoing with absolute authority. We bought it all for pennies on the dollar. You do not have an insulated real estate empire anymore. You are now completely and entirely insolvent. Charles stumbled backward, as if he had been physically struck. He hit the edge of a leather executive chair and gripped it to keep from collapsing to the floor. He shook his head, muttering that it was legally impossible and that corporate restructuring paperwork takes months to clear through the federal courts. Kendra calmly tapped the thick stack of financial documents. She told him the expedited legal filings were fully executed and time-stamped by a federal bankruptcy judge at exactly 6:00 this morning. She then formally notified him in front of all his wealthiest peers that his entire empire was now the legal property of my trust, and his personal accounts had been frozen by the entire federal government. I stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with the brilliant woman who had helped me orchestrate this flawless execution. I looked Charles dead in the eye and delivered the final crushing blow. I told him that I was no longer just the daughter-in-law he despised. I was his supreme creditor. I owned the massive debt on this very skyscraper we were currently standing in. I owned the mortgage on his sprawling luxury estate in the Hamptons. I also owned the financing on his private jet and his entire prized fleet of luxury cars. Because he was now in severe default on every single one of those financial obligations, I was initiating an immediate hostile corporate foreclosure right here in the boardroom. The reaction from the board members was instantaneous and violent. The wealthy shareholders suddenly scrambled out of their chairs, distancing themselves from the two men. They shouted over each other, demanding that their legal counsel immediately sever all corporate ties with Charles and his holding company. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a sinking ship that was currently under federal investigation. Nobody wanted to be standing anywhere near the blast radius of a massive federal racketeering charge. Charles was officially bankrupt and completely isolated. His massive empire had fallen in exactly 5 minutes. Charles stood completely alone at the edge of the mahogany table. The wealthy investors who had kissed his ring for decades were now practically climbing over each other to reach the heavy glass doors. I did not let him look away. I closed the remaining physical distance between us, stepping right into his personal space. I looked Charles dead in the eye. For years, this man had looked down at me, treating me like a disposable asset. He had orchestrated my murder while sipping a martini. Now the arrogance in his eyes had been entirely replaced by a hollow primal terror. I told him that the hostile foreclosure was not a future threat or a legal maneuver he could stall in the courts. It was happening right at this very second. I gave a sharp nod to Kendra. She picked up a sleek black tablet from her briefcase and tapped the screen, executing a synchronized command. I explained to Charles that the federal bankruptcy judge had granted an emergency immediate seizure order. Because his massive debts were inextricably tied to a federal racketeering and money laundering investigation, the court recognized him as an extreme flight risk. I told him that right now, at this exact moment, heavily armed private security teams, contracted by my trust, were walking into the lobbies of his commercial properties across the country. They were escorting his executives out of the buildings and changing the digital locks on every single door. His corporate empire was being physically dismantled while he stood here watching, helpless to stop it. Charles shook his head violently, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He reached into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out his smartphone with trembling fingers. He frantically opened his private offshore banking application, desperately trying to verify his personal wealth. I watched his eyes dart across the glowing screen. I knew exactly what he was seeing, a bright red zero. Kendra stepped up beside me and told him that the asset freeze was absolute. She explained that the trust had filed emergency injunctions against his personal checking accounts, his offshore retirement portfolios, and his hidden shell companies. He had absolutely zero access to liquid cash anywhere in the world. He could not even afford to buy a cup of coffee downstairs in his own lobby. I wanted him to feel the exact same profound helplessness I felt when I was drowning in the freezing ocean. I leaned in closer and lowered my voice so only he and Preston could hear. I brought up his sprawling luxury estate in the Hamptons. It was a massive 30-room mansion that Charles prized above everything else. I reminded him of the very first family dinner I attended there, when he pulled me aside and told me I would never truly belong in his exclusive world. I told him that a separate eviction team was currently at the mansion. They were dragging his expensive imported furniture out onto the front lawn and tossing his custom-tailored suits into heavy black garbage bags. I smiled and told him I planned to bulldoze the entire estate to the ground and turn it into a parking lot just because I had the financial power to do it. The reality of his absolute destruction finally shattered his remaining composure. Charles dropped his expensive phone. It clattered against the hardwood floor, bouncing near my red heels. He turned his desperate eyes toward the few remaining board members who were hovering near the exit. He reached out a shaking hand and begged them for help. He pleaded with his oldest friends, asking for a temporary bridge loan just to hire a criminal defense attorney. He promised them massive returns if they would just float him a few $1 million to survive the week. The board members did not say a word. They refused to even make eye contact with him. They simply adjusted their ties, picked up their leather briefcases, and walked out of the boardroom one by one. The mass exodus of his wealthy allies was the final nail in his coffin. Charles watched the heavy glass doors swing shut behind the last board member, leaving him entirely isolated with me, Kendra, and the FBI task force. His shoulders slumped and the aggressive posture of the real estate titan evaporated. He looked like a fragile, broken old man. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for him. I told Charles that the federal government seizing his assets was actually the least of his problems right now. I reminded him about the ruthless money laundering cartel waiting in Miami. They were watching his every move, and they were not known for their patience or their mercy. Preston whimpered from his spot on the floor, covering his head with his arms. I ignored my husband and kept my focus entirely on Charles. I explained that the cartel was expecting a massive wire transfer by noon today. When that money failed to arrive, they were not going to call his lawyers to negotiate. They were going to come looking for blood. And because I now controlled the payroll for his entire corporate structure, his massive private security detail had been officially terminated as of 10 minutes ago. He had no bodyguards. He had no armored vehicles. He had absolutely no protection from the violent criminals he had partnered with to steal my fortune. Charles let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. His knees finally buckled under the crushing weight of his new reality. The man who thought he was an untouchable god collapsed onto the expensive carpet right next to his terrified son. He stared blankly at the torn pieces of the bank authorization form scattered across the floor. The $5.5 billion he thought would save him had instead become the exact weapon I used to destroy his entire life. I stood over them, watching the complete and utter ruin of the two men who had tried to erase my existence. I had taken their money, their homes, their freedom, and their dignity. I owned every single piece of their world, and I was going to let the federal agents clean up whatever garbage was left behind. The hostile foreclosure was executed with flawless precision, leaving his empire in ashes. Charles stared down at the torn pieces of the authorization form, leaving his empire in ashes. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the massive boardroom was the heavy, panicked breathing of my husband groveling on the floor. Charles slowly raised his head. I watched the gears turning behind his cold, calculating eyes. He was a survivor above all else. For decades, he had built his real estate empire by stepping on the throats of his partners, his competitors, and even his own family. Now facing the absolute certainty of life in a federal penitentiary, his primal instinct kicked in. He realized that his money was gone, his power was gone, and his corporate shield had been shattered. The only currency he had left to trade was his own flesh and blood. Charles straightened his ruined suit jacket and turned his back on me. He walked directly toward Special Agent Harris, holding both of his hands up in a gesture of complete surrender. He did not look like a proud billionaire anymore. He looked like a desperate cornered rat trying to negotiate his way out of a trap. "Listen to me," Charles said, his voice trembling with a sickening mixture of fear and forced authority. "I want to make a deal. I want full immunity and federal protection. I am a victim here." Agent Harris raised an eyebrow, crossing his thick arms over his chest. He did not say a word, allowing the silence to hang heavy in the air. Charles pointed a shaking finger down at Preston, who was still curled up on the carpet. "He is a sociopath!" Charles shouted, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "The murder plot on the yacht was entirely his idea. I had absolutely nothing to do with it. He owed the Miami cartel $200 million, and they threatened to kill our entire family. He told me he was going to fake her death to get the buyout money. When we were on the boat, I was drunk. I was looking the other way. I did not know he was actually going to push her into the ocean until I heard the splash. He forced me to go along with the cover-up. He threatened to frame me for the tax evasion if I did not help him stage the funeral." I stood next to Kendra, feeling a wave of absolute disgust wash over me. The audio from the hidden camera had clearly captured Charles laughing and sipping a martini while I was pushed to my death. But Charles was so desperate, he was willing to rewrite history and throw his own son to the wolves just to shave a few years off his impending sentence. He continued to ramble, offering to give the FBI the names of Preston's cartel contacts, the offshore account numbers, and every single detail of the money laundering operation. He was offering up his son on a silver platter. On the floor, Preston stopped whimpering. He slowly lowered his arms and looked up at his father. Preston's face was streaked with tears and sweat, but the expression of pure terror was rapidly shifting into something else. It was a look of total, absolute betrayal. Preston had spent his entire life trying to earn the approval of this monster. He had committed fraud, he had stolen, and he had literally tried to murder his own wife just to secure the funds to save his father's failing empire. And this was his reward. His father was selling him out to the federal government without a second thought. "You liar," Preston whispered, his voice cracking. "You told me to do it. You told me she was expendable." Shut your mouth, you pathetic failure, Charles spat, looking down at his son with unmasked hatred. You ruined this family. You ruined my life. I should have let the cartel chop you into pieces. Something inside Preston violently snapped. The psychological break was instantaneous. He let out a guttural, animalistic scream that tore from the very bottom of his lungs. He lunged upward, launching his entire body off the carpet like a coiled spring. He tackled his father perfectly at the waist. The sheer force of the impact lifted Charles off his feet and sent both men crashing backward into the heavy mahogany table. The impact was deafening. Charles' head slammed against the thick wooden edge with a sickening crunch. They hit the floor together, a tangled mass of expensive wool suits and flailing limbs. Preston mounted his father, his face contorted in a mask of pure feral rage. He raised his fist and brought it down hard across Charles' face. The sharp crack of breaking cartilage echoed through the boardroom as Charles' nose shattered. Blood immediately erupted, splashing bright red across his crisp white collar. Charles roared in pain and fought back, grabbing a handful of Preston's perfectly styled hair and pulling hard. He drove his knee upward, catching Preston in the ribs. The two wealthy, pampered men who had spent their lives hiding behind lawyers and corporate security guards were now tearing at each other like wild dogs. They rolled across the expensive carpet, grunting and swearing violently. Preston clawed at his father's face, ripping the skin near his eye. Charles managed to land a heavy blow to Preston's jaw, sending a spray of blood and saliva across the glass wall of the boardroom. It was the most pathetic, undignified display of violence I had ever witnessed. I watched them destroy each other with a cold, detached satisfaction. Kendra stood perfectly still beside me, her arms crossed, watching the two men who had tormented her family finally tear each other to shreds. These were the men who looked down on everyone else who thought their money made them civilized and untouchable. Now they were rolling in their own blood, destroying the very boardroom they used to rule. The federal agents instinctively stepped forward to break up the brawl, but Agent Harris held up a single hand. He stopped his men, letting the fight continue for another long, satisfying moment. Harris watched the two billionaires bloody each other, recognizing that this physical humiliation was part of their punishment. The sound of fists hitting flesh and the tearing of expensive fabric filled the silent corporate space. Only when Charles began to wheeze, choking on his own blood, did Harris finally nod his head. The FBI tactical team swarmed the two men. It took 4 heavily armed agents to pull Preston off his father. Preston was kicking and screaming, spitting blood onto the carpet, completely lost in his violent hysteria. Charles lay flat on his back, groaning in agony, his face a swollen, bloody mess, his expensive suit ripped and stained. The architects of my murder had been utterly broken, not just financially, but mentally and physically. The betrayal was complete and the destruction of their legacy was entirely permanent. The FBI agents hauled Preston up from the blood-stained carpet. His expensive custom suit was completely ruined, torn at the shoulder, and smeared with his father's blood. The metallic ratcheting sound of the heavy steel handcuffs closing tightly around his wrists echoed through the boardroom. 2 other agents pulled Charles to his feet. Charles groaned in absolute agony, his face a swollen, unrecognizable mask of bruised purple flesh and shattered cartilage. He could not even stand under his own power, requiring the federal agents to hold him upright. His eyes were glazed over, staring blankly at the floor as the reality of his total destruction finally settled into his shattered mind. Preston was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as the last remnants of his adrenaline faded away. As the agents read their Miranda rights outlining massive charges from conspiracy to commit murder to federal racketeering, the fight completely drained out of my husband. His legs gave out. Despite the agents gripping his arms, Preston collapsed, dropping heavily to his knees right in front of me. He looked up, and the arrogant, charismatic man I had married was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, pathetic shell of a human being. "Vanessa, please!" He begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "Please, you have to help me. You have to tell them I did not want to do it." He was openly weeping now, thick tears carving clean lines through the blood and sweat on his face. He pleaded with me to use my leverage as the primary victim to negotiate a plea deal on his behalf. He swore he would give the FBI everything. He promised to testify against his father in open court and surrender every single asset he had ever owned. He was offering me the world, completely forgetting that I had already taken it from him. He begged me to remember the good times, the charity galas, the vacations, the quiet moments we shared before the corporate buyout corrupted everything. He was desperately trying to manipulate my emotions, playing the role of the helpless victim who was just caught in the crossfire of his father's toxic ambition. I stood looking down at the man kneeling at my feet. I did not feel a single shred of empathy. I looked at his hands, the same hands that had violently shoved me off the deck of the luxury yacht into the freezing black water. I remembered the agonizing cold piercing my skin like a million needles. I remembered the sheer terror of fighting for breath in the absolute darkness while he went back to his warm cabin to celebrate his massive payday. I leaned down slightly, my face just inches from his. I told him that I did remember the good times. I told him I remembered exactly how his voice sounded when he leaned into my ear and told me to enjoy my swim with the sharks. I kept my voice low and completely devoid of emotion. I told Preston that mercy was a luxury reserved for human beings, and he had surrendered his humanity the moment he decided my life was worth less than his offshore gambling debts. Preston let out a wretched, sobbing gasp, realizing that I was an impenetrable wall of ice. He turned his desperate, pleading eyes toward Kendra. He begged my sister-in-law to intervene, pleading with her legal expertise. He offered to sign whatever documents she wanted, begging her to draft a cooperation agreement that would keep him out of a maximum security federal penitentiary. Kendra looked down at him with a calm, clinical expression. She adjusted the cuffs of her immaculate blazer and tapped the screen of her sleek black tablet. She did not offer him a single ounce of sympathy. Instead, she delivered the final psychological blow with the effortless grace of a master tactician. Kendra informed Preston that she had not just been busy buying up his father's defaulted real estate loans over the weekend. She explained that as a meticulous tax attorney, she hated leaving loose ends. She told him that she had traced the routing numbers for the fake charitable foundation he had set up to launder the buyout funds. Through those digital records, she had located the primary communication channels for the Miami money laundering cartel. Preston's crying instantly stopped. His eyes went wide with a new, unimaginable level of terror. He stared at Kendra, his breath catching in his throat. Kendra smiled a cold, calculating smile. She casually informed my husband that 30 minutes ago, right before we walked into this boardroom, she had sent a highly encrypted anonymous message directly to the cartel's primary fixer. She provided them with the exact address of this corporate headquarters. She also sent them a verified screenshot of the canceled wire transfer, proving that Preston never had the $5.5 billion and was actively planning to defraud them. Preston began to shake so violently his teeth chattered. Kendra leaned forward and delivered the absolute worst news he could possibly hear. She told him that 3 black, heavily armored SUVs had just pulled into the corporate plaza downstairs. The cartel was not waiting in Miami anymore. They were currently sitting outside the building, blocking the main exits. "You see, Preston," Kendra said, her voice perfectly smooth and conversational. "The FBI is going to arrest you today. But federal agents have rules. The men waiting for you downstairs do not. The cartel knows you are heading into federal custody, which means they will be waiting for you in the transport vehicles in the holding cells or the very second you try to post bail." The absolute horror of his situation finally crushed him. Preston realized that the federal penitentiary was no longer a punishment. It was his only possible safe haven, and even that was entirely compromised. He was a dead man walking, marked by a ruthless criminal syndicate with unlimited reach. He screamed, thrashing wildly against the federal agents, begging them not to take him outside, begging them to lock him in a subterranean vault where nobody could ever find him. The FBI agents hauled him back to his feet, ignoring his hysterical screaming. They marched him and his father toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, dragging them out of the executive suite. I stood beside Kendra, watching my husband being hauled away, knowing that every single second of his remaining life would be consumed by absolute paralyzing fear. "Wait!" I said, my voice cutting through the chaotic noise of the struggling men. Special Agent Harris raised a hand, signaling his team to pause just inches from the heavy glass doors. The agents held my husband and my father-in-law firmly in place. Charles was slouched forward, bleeding heavily onto the polished hardwood floor, too dazed to even lift his head. But Preston looked up at me. His face was a mask of absolute, terrified desperation. He was still trembling violently, knowing what awaited him outside the corporate plaza. I walked slowly across the room until I was standing directly in front of him. I looked down at the man who had promised to cherish and protect me for the rest of my life. For 4 years I had worn his heavy diamond on my left hand. It was a flawless custom-cut stone worth $500,000. When he slipped it onto my finger, I thought it was a symbol of our unbreakable partnership. Now I knew it was nothing more than a tracking collar, a shiny, expensive shackle designed to keep me docile while he quietly planned to drain my life force and steal my empire. I raised my left hand. Preston's bloodshot eyes tracked the movement. I grasped the heavy platinum band with my right hand and slowly pulled it over my knuckle. The metal felt ice cold against my skin. The diamond caught the morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, sparkling with a brilliant, deceptive beauty. Preston let out a pathetic, whimpering sound, thinking I was going to hand it to him to use as a bargaining chip or a bribe for the cartel. Instead, I turned my body slightly toward the corner of the room. A sleek stainless steel trash can sat next to the mahogany credenza. I held the $500,000 ring over the open cylinder and simply opened my fingers. The heavy ring dropped. It hit the bottom of the empty metal bin with a sharp, resonating clink. Preston's eyes widened in absolute shock. He stared at the trash can as if I had just thrown a piece of his own soul into the garbage. That ring was worth more than most people made in a lifetime, and I discarded it like a piece of worthless plastic. To me, that was exactly what it was. It represented a lie I was no longer willing to carry. I stepped closer, leaning down until my face was only inches from his ear. I could smell the stale sweat and copper blood on his ruined suit. I kept my voice incredibly soft, ensuring only he could hear my final goodbye. "Enjoy your swim in federal prison," I whispered. The words hit him like a physical blow. It was the exact sentence he had whispered to me right before he shoved me into the freezing black ocean. The poetic justice of the moment shattered whatever tiny fragment of hope he had left clinging to his chest. His eyes rolled back, and he let out a long, agonizing wail. Agent Harris gave a sharp nod to his men. "Take them out," Harris ordered. The federal agents dragged Preston and Charles through the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. I stood perfectly still, watching them disappear down the long, carpeted hallway toward the private elevators. The sound of Preston's hysterical sobbing echoed down the corridor, growing fainter and fainter, until the heavy steel elevator doors finally slid shut. And then there was silence. The massive corporate boardroom was completely empty except for me and Kendra. The chaotic energy that had filled the room for the past hour rapidly dissipated, leaving behind a profound sense of stillness. I looked around at the overturned leather executive chairs, the shattered coffee cups, and the bloodstains ruining the expensive carpet. It looked like a war zone, but it was a war we had definitively won. I felt a sudden rush of exhaustion wash over my entire body. The adrenaline that had kept me awake and functioning at peak mental capacity for the past 48 hours was finally beginning to crash. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp air-conditioned air fill my lungs. I was alive. I was truly alive, and the heavy, suffocating weight of my toxic marriage had been entirely lifted from my shoulders. Kendra walked over and placed a warm, steadying hand on my shoulder. She looked at the blood on the floor and then looked at me, a fierce, proud smile spreading across her beautiful face. "We actually did it," Kendra said, her voice echoing softly in the quiet room. "We burned the entire empire to the ground. They have absolutely nothing left." I turned to face her, feeling a genuine smile break through my exhausted features for the first time in days. "We did not just burn it to the ground," I corrected her gently. "We bought the ashes. This building belongs to us now." Kendra laughed, a rich, joyful sound that filled the empty corporate space. She picked up her heavy leather briefcase, securing the irrevocable trust documents and the financial audit trails. She adjusted her immaculate blazer, looking every inch the powerful chief legal officer she was born to be. She told me it was time to go home. We had mountains of legal paperwork to sort through over the next few weeks, but the hardest part was officially over. We walked out of the boardroom together, leaving the wreckage behind us. We stepped into the private executive elevator and rode it down to the ground floor. When the doors opened, the main lobby was swarming with federal agents and private security contractors securing the building under the new ownership directives. The security guard who had tried to stop us earlier was nowhere to be seen. The staff looked at us with a mixture of fear and profound respect parting out of our way as we walked toward the revolving glass doors. As we stepped out onto the concrete plaza, the bright mid-morning sun hit my face, warming my cold skin. I looked toward the edge of the street. The three black armored SUVs Kendra had warned Preston about were still parked silently along the curb. The tinted windows rolled up, hiding the ruthless cartel men waiting inside. They were watching the federal transport vehicles loading Charles and Preston into the back of heavily armored police vans. The cartel was tracking their investment, and Preston knew he could never escape their gaze. I did not look back at the police vans. I did not care what happened to my husband in the transport cell or in the federal penitentiary. His fate was no longer my concern. I took a deep breath of the fresh city air, feeling the immense power of my own survival. I hailed a black car, and Kendra and I climbed into the back seat, ready to start building a new empire entirely on our own terms. 6 months have passed since that morning in the boardroom. The wheels of federal justice usually turn slowly, but when you hand the FBI a perfectly wrapped package of wire fraud extortion and a recorded murder confession, the courts tend to move with terrifying speed. Preston and Charles did not even make it to a full trial. Facing a mountain of indisputable digital evidence and the very real threat of cartel assassins waiting outside the courthouse, they took a blind plea deal just to stay in federal protective custody. The judge was not feeling generous. They were both sentenced to 40 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. I heard through the legal grapevine that prison has not been kind to either of them. The Miami cartel has a massive reach inside the penal system. My former husband and my former father-in-law spend 23 hours a day locked in solitary confinement, terrified of their own shadows, knowing that the debt they owe can still be collected behind bars. They tried to throw me to the sharks, but they ended up locking themselves in a cage with the monsters. With Charles permanently removed from the chessboard, the hostile foreclosure of his real estate empire proceeded flawlessly. I did not keep his buildings. I had absolutely no desire to manage the rotting foundation of his legacy. Instead, I liquidated his entire portfolio. I sold off his commercial high-rises, his luxury residential complexes, and the sprawling Hamptons estate. I watched with immense satisfaction as the bulldozers rolled onto his pristine manicured lawn and tore the 30-room mansion to the ground, just like I promised. I took the billions from those sales, combined it with the $5.5 billion from my biotech buyout, and built something entirely new. I launched a global venture capital firm dedicated exclusively to funding minority women in the technology and medical sciences sectors. I wanted to make sure that brilliant women who were constantly overlooked or marginalized by men like Charles finally had the financial backing to change the world. And I did not build this new empire alone. Kendra was the only choice for my chief legal officer. She took the position and completely revolutionized our corporate structure. The woman who was once mocked and belittled at family dinners is now the most feared and respected legal mind in the financial district. When Kendra walks into a boardroom today, billionaires sit up straight and pay attention. She is brilliant, ruthless, and fiercely loyal. Wyatt is thriving as well. Freed from the toxic expectations of his father and brother, he is currently touring Europe, composing beautiful music and living entirely on his own terms. My parents are safe too. The day after Charles and Preston were arrested, I bought them a gorgeous estate in upstate New York overlooking a peaceful lake. It was placed in an impenetrable trust that nobody could ever touch. When I handed my father the keys, he cried, holding my mother tightly. They had lost their son-in-law, but they realized they had never truly lost me. Healing from the trauma of that night on the ocean has been a long process. There are still nights when I wake up shivering, feeling the phantom chill of the salt water against my skin. But the fear no longer controls me. It has been replaced by a deep, unshakable resilience. I am standing right now on the balcony of my new penthouse in Manhattan. I sold the old apartment immediately, wanting nothing to do with the space where Preston had paraded his mistress. This new home is entirely mine. The crisp evening breeze whips past my face, carrying the distant sounds of the city below. The New York skyline stretches out in front of me, a sea of glittering lights and endless possibilities. Holding a glass of vintage red wine, I look down at my left hand. The finger where my heavy diamond ring used to sit is completely bare. It feels incredibly light. It feels like freedom. Surviving the absolute worst betrayal imaginable fundamentally changed how I view the world. They thought I was just a walking trust fund, a naive girl they could easily discard when my usefulness ran out. But they forgot that pressure creates diamonds, and extreme pressure creates something unbreakable. I learned the hardest way possible that blood simply makes you related. It is just biology. Loyalty is what actually makes you family. Kendra proved that to me. She proved that the people who stand by you when the water is freezing and the night is entirely dark are the only ones who deserve to stand by you in the light. Now I want to hear from all of you. Family dynamics can be incredibly complicated, and sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones holding the knife. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your own peace and sanity? How did you find the strength to establish those unbreakable boundaries? What was the turning point that made you realize you deserved better than conditional love and constant manipulation? Please drop your stories in the comments below. Reading your experiences helps all of us realize that we are never alone in these battles. If my journey resonated with you, and if you believe in fighting back, when the world tries to push you under, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with anyone who might need a reminder that their kindness is not a weakness and their success is worth protecting. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and remember to never let anyone dictate your worth. Surviving this profound betrayal taught me one vital lesson. True family is built on unwavering loyalty, never just biology or marriage. When the people supposed to protect you become your greatest threat, you must become your own savior. We often tolerate toxic behavior from relatives due to the illusion of obligation. However, true power comes from recognizing your worth and setting unbreakable boundaries. Escaping a toxic environment is not a tragedy. It is the necessary clearing of ashes to build your true empire. What is the hardest boundary you have ever set with a toxic relative? Tell me in the comments below.